They didn't knock. The social workers never knocked in places like that. Pine Ridge, South Dakota, 1974. A farmhouse 7 miles from anything resembling civilization, where the wind carried dust and the smell of decades-old rot. When they opened that door, they found 3 sisters, ages 9, 11, and 13, sitting in a room with no furniture, no beds, no light except what leaked through boards nailed over the windows. The eldest sister was holding the youngest, and when they asked her name, she couldn't remember it. None of them could. What the investigators found in that house would take 40 years to fully understand, and what those girls revealed, slowly, painfully across months of therapy and testimony, wasn't just their story. It was the story of an entire bloodline, a family that had perfected the art of disappearing its own children. This isn't about a single crime. This is about inheritance, about what gets passed down when no one is watching, about what happens when silence becomes tradition. The Pine Ridge sisters survived, but what they survived had been waiting in that family for generations, and in 1974 it finally broke through the surface. The house was registered under the name of Martha Colburn, age 57, a widow, no criminal record, no history with child services. To the county, she didn't exist as anything more than a tax return and a post office box. The sisters were never enrolled in school, never seen by a doctor, never photographed. There were no birth certificates on file. When investigators tried to piece together how 3 children could vanish into rural South Dakota without leaving a trace, they realized something far more disturbing. It wasn't an accident, it was a system, and it had been running quietly, efficiently for longer than anyone wanted to believe. The youngest sister, when she finally spoke, said something that still appears in case files today. She said they weren't the first. She said there had been others, and she said some of them never left. The social workers who entered that house in March of 1974 weren't prepared for what silence looks like when it's been enforced for years. The sisters didn't cry, didn't ask questions, didn't react to kindness or authority. They moved like shadows. When offered food, they waited. When asked if they were hurt, they stared. It took 3 days before the middle sister spoke a full sentence. She said, "We're not supposed to talk about the barn." The investigators hadn't asked about a barn. They hadn't mentioned it. But there it was, 200 yards from the main house, listing to one side, its roof half collapsed. When they finally got a warrant to search it, they found a root cellar beneath the floor. And inside that cellar, they found chains, 4 sets, bolted into the foundation rut. Beside them, carved into the wooden support beam, were names, 17 names, some scratched deep, some barely visible. None of them matched the 3 sisters they'd pulled from the house. Martha Colburn refused to speak. Not to police. Not to her court-appointed attorney, not to the psychiatrist who evaluated her. She sat in county lockup with her hands folded, her face blank, and said nothing. But the sisters talked, slowly. In fragments, the eldest, who they later identified as Sarah, told them about the rules. There were always rules. Don't speak unless spoken to. Don't leave your room after dark. Don't ask about the others. And never ever go near the barn unless you're told. She said her grandmother had lived in that house before Martha, and her great-grandmother before that. She said the barn had always been there. She said the rules had always been the same. When investigators pulled county records, they found something that made the case much worse. The Colburn family had owned that land since 1889. The farmhouse had been standing for over 80 years. And in all that time, across 4 generations, no one had ever reported anything wrong. The names in the barn became the center of the investigation. 17 names, some were just first names, Emma, Thomas, Lily. Others were initials, JCMW. The oldest carvings were so worn they were nearly illegible. The forensic team brought in specialists, historians, genealogists. They cross-referenced census records, birth registries, missing persons reports going back to the turn of the century. What they found wasn't a list of strangers. It was a family tree. Every name they could identify belonged to a child born into the Colburn family. Daughters, mostly some sons. Children who were recorded at birth and then simply ceased to exist in any official capacity. No school records, no medical files. No death certificates. They vanished into that property and the paper trail went cold. The youngest name they could date was from 1967, a girl named Anna. She would have been 16 in 1974. The sisters said they remembered her. She'd been in the barn, and then one winter she wasn't. The state brought in cadaver dogs. They searched the property for weeks, dug up sections of the field, scanned the barn, checked the walls of the house. They found nothing. No bodies, no bones, no evidence of burial. It was as if those children had evaporated. But the sisters insisted. They'd seen others, heard them through the walls, watched them disappear. The middle sister, who they called Rebecca, told investigators about the room beneath the kitchen. A crawl space, she said. You could hear people down there sometimes, crying, talking to themselves. She said Martha would go down there with a lantern and stay for hours. When pressed, Rebecca said she didn't know what happened to the people in the crawl space. She just knew that after a while, they stopped making noise. The excavation team returned. They tore up the kitchen floor, and there, hidden beneath rotted planks and a false foundation, they found it. A chamber, 8 feet by 12. No windows, no ventilation, just dirt, darkness, and a single wooden chair bolted to the ground. On the wall, scratched into the clay, was a message. It said, "Tell them we were real. The trial of Martha Colburn never happened." In August of 1974, 4 months after her arrest, she suffered a massive stroke in her cell. She died 3 days later without regaining consciousness. The case should have ended there. But the sisters kept talking, and what they revealed wasn't just about Martha. It was about a belief system, a family doctrine that had been passed down like an heirloom. Sarah, the eldest, told psychologists that her grandmother had explained it to her when she was 5 years old. She said some children were born wrong, born with something inside them that needed to be corrected. The family had a responsibility, her grandmother said, to fix them before they infected the world. That's what the barn was for. That's what the room beneath the kitchen was for, to make them pure, to make them silent, to make them disappear if they couldn't be saved. Sarah said her grandmother wasn't cruel. She didn't rage or scream. She was calm. She believed fully and without question that what she was doing was holy, that the suffering was necessary, that isolation was love. The psychologists who worked with the sisters documented something they called inherited trauma architecture. The Colburn family had built a system of abuse so normalized, so deeply embedded in their family identity that the children didn't recognize it as abuse. They thought it was discipline, tradition, the way families worked. Rebecca told her therapist that she used to wonder when it would be her turn to run the house. She assumed that one day, when she was older, she'd be the one enforcing the rules. She'd be the one taking children to the barn, because that's what women in her family did. That's what her mother would have done if she'd lived. The system wasn't just about control. It was about legacy, and it had been operating uninterrupted for nearly a century. The sisters were supposed to inherit it. They were being trained, groomed, prepared to carry it forward. The only reason they didn't was because a neighbor, a man who hadn't seen smoke from the Colburn chimney in 3 weeks, called the county. He thought maybe the old woman had died. He had no idea what he'd actually found. The state of South Dakota tried to find the other children, the ones whose names were carved in the barn. They combed through decades of records, interviewed distant relatives, tracked down anyone connected to the Colburn family line. Most of the relatives claimed ignorance. They said they'd lost touch with Martha years ago, said the family had always been private, kept to themselves. A few admitted they'd heard rumors, whispers about children who were kept home, homeschooled, they assumed, or sickly. But no one ever asked directly, no one ever visited, and no one ever reported anything to authorities. The investigators found one cousin, a woman named Dorothy Marsh, who'd grown up 3 counties over. She told them something that still sits in the case file, underlined in red ink. She said that when she was a girl, maybe 8 or 9, her mother had taken her to visit the Colburn farm. It was a Sunday. They brought a casserole. Dorothy remembered seeing a little girl in the window of the barn, just for a second, pale face, dark eyes, staring. She asked her mother who that was. Her mother told her to stop looking, told her it wasn't polite to stare. On the drive home, her mother said the Colburns handled things their own way. She said some families had responsibilities that others didn't understand. And she told Dorothy, very clearly, to never speak about what she saw. Dorothy never went back, never asked again. And when investigators asked why she didn't report it, even decades later, she said something that defines the entire case. She said, "I thought it was normal. I thought every family had secrets like that." If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? Would you have spoken up? Or would you have stayed silent like so many others did? Because that's the question that haunts this case. Not what happened in that house, but how many people knew or suspected and chose to look away. The Pine Ridge sisters didn't just survive a house of horrors. They survived a community that allowed it, a system that enabled it, a bloodline that protected it. And when they finally spoke, they revealed something far more terrifying than one woman's cruelty. They revealed how easy it is to hide atrocity in plain sight when everyone agrees not to see it. The Pine Ridge sisters were separated after the trial collapsed. Sarah was placed with a foster family in Minnesota. Rebecca went to a group home in Iowa. The youngest, who they eventually identified as Margaret, was adopted by a family in Nebraska who requested anonymity. For years, the case faded. The farmhouse was seized by the county, then sold at auction. A developer bought the land, tore down the structures, and built nothing. It sits empty to this day. The barn is gone, the house is gone, but the ground remains. In 1989, 15 years after the sisters were found, a documentary crew tried to locate them for interviews. They found Sarah. She was 24, married, living under a different name. She agreed to speak, but only once and only off camera. What she told them was never broadcast, but the producer kept notes. Sarah said she still dreamed about the house. Not nightmares exactly, just memories. She said the worst part wasn't the fear or the isolation. It was the realization years later that she'd been taught to see suffering as love, that she'd been conditioned to believe her own erasure was a kindness. She said it took her a decade to understand that what happened to her wasn't discipline. It was annihilation, and the hardest part of survival was learning that she was allowed to exist at all. Rebecca was never located. Margaret's adoptive family declined all contact. The documentary was never made, but Sarah's words circulated quietly among trauma researchers and social workers. She became a case study in something called generational erasure, the idea that certain families don't just abuse their children, they systematically remove them from existence. No documentation, no socialization, no acknowledgement, as if they were never born. The Colburn family perfected this, and they did it for generations without interference because rural isolation and family privacy were considered sacred. The case files were sealed in 1991 due to the involvement of minors. Most of the physical evidence was destroyed. The names carved into the barn were photographed, cataloged, and then lost in a storage facility fire in 1998. Today, the only proof that those 17 children existed at all is a single banker's box in a South Dakota courthouse basement. Inside are 3 interviews with the sisters, a stack of crime scene photos, and a handwritten note from the lead investigator. It says, "One never found them, but they were real, and they're still out there somewhere in the soil." The Pine Ridge sisters revealed something that America still struggles to confront, that the most dangerous secrets aren't hidden in locked rooms or buried in shallow graves. They're hidden in silence, in the agreement not to ask questions, in the assumption that what happens behind closed doors is no one else's business. The Colburn family didn't survive for nearly a century because they were careful. They survived because the systems designed to protect children, schools, hospitals, neighbors, law enforcement, never looked. Or when they did look, they chose to see nothing. The sisters were found because one man noticed a cold chimney, not because anyone suspected abuse, not because a teacher reported absences, not because a doctor saw bruises, because of smoke. That's how close they came to disappearing completely. And that's how close the others came too. The 17 names in the barn, the voices in the crawl space, the children who were born into that family and erased before they could become people. We talk about monsters as if they're rare, as if they emerge fully formed, isolated, unprecedented, but the Colburn family proves something more disturbing. Monsters aren't born in a vacuum. They're cultivated, normalized, passed down. The abuse that happened in that farmhouse wasn't an anomaly. It was a tradition, and traditions don't survive alone. They need complicity. They need witnesses who choose blindness. They need communities that value privacy over protection. The sisters survived. But how many others didn't? How many names were never carved into wood? How many children vanished into the American landscape, into family land, into basements and barns and back rooms, and were never counted because no one was counting? The Pine Ridge case isn't just a story about 3 girls who escaped. It's a story about the ones who didn't, about the system that let it happen, and about the silence that still protects secrets we're too afraid to uncover. The farmhouse is gone. The barn is gone. But the ground remembers. And somewhere in the records we don't keep and the questions we don't ask, there are more names, more children, more families who learned that the best way to hide a body is to make sure no one knows it existed in the first place. The Pine Ridge sisters told the truth. The question is whether we're ready to hear it.